Meantime, there had been constructed an African agency by the Jewish slave dealers, who had corralled them and prepared them for sale. This organization, reaching deep into Africa, had many ramifications, including the heads of groups, villages, etc. This method to win over these leaders for the Jewish slave trade was similar to that which the Jews had employed with the Indians. At first, they presented them with rum, and soon found themselves in an alcoholic delirium. When the gold dust and ivory supply was exhausted, they were induced to sell their descendants. At first their wives, and then their youths. Then they began warfare among each other, plotted and developed mostly by the Jews. And if they captured prisoners, these too were exchanged for rum, ammunitions, and weapons to the Jews, using them for further campaigns to capture more Negroes. The captured blacks were linked 2 by 2 and driven through the medieval forests to the coast. These painful treks required weeks, and some of them frequently became ill and felled by exhaustion, and many unable to rise, even though the bullwhip was applied as an encourager. They were left to die and were devoured by wild beasts. It was not unusual to see the bones of the dead laying in the tropical sun, a sad and gruesome reminder of those who would later on tread this path. It has been calculated that for each Negro who withstood the rigors of this wandering, there still had to be the long voyage across the ocean before they reached American soil. 9 out of 10 died. And when one considers that there was a yearly exodus of 1 million black slaves, then, and only then, can one assess the tremendous and extensive exodus of the African people. At present, Africa is thinly populated, not alone due to the 1 million literally dragged out of huts, but due to the 5 to 9 million who never reached their destination. Once they reached the coast, the black slaves were driven together, and restraints were applied to hold them until the next transport ship docked. The agents, many of them Jews, who represented the chief, then began the deal with the captain. Each Negro was personally presented to him, but the captains had learned to become suspicious. The black one must move his fingers, arms, legs, and the entire body to ensure that there were not any fractures. Even the teeth were examined. If a tooth was lacking, it lowered the price. Most of the Jew agents knew how to treat sick Negroes with chemicals in order to sell them as sound. Each Negro was valued at about 100 gallons of rum, 100 pounds of gunpowder, or in cash between $18 to $20. The notations of a captain inform us that on September 5th, 1763, one Negro brought as much as 200 gallons of rum, due to the bidding amongst the agents raising the price. Women under 25 years, pregnant or not, resulted in the same measure if they were well and comely. Any over 25 years lost 25%. And here it should be stated that those Negroes purchased free at the African coast for $20 to $40 were then resold by the same slave dealers in America for $2,000. This gives one an idea how the Jews managed to acquire tremendous fortunes. Following the bargaining, Captain Friedman paid the bill, either in merchandise or cash. He also recalled some advice which his Jewish employers gave him as he left Newport for Africa. Quote, "Pour as much water into the rum as you possibly can." Unquote. In this manner, the Negro chiefs were cheated 2 times by the Newport Jews. The next step was to shave the hair from the head of the acquired slaves. Then they were bound and branded with a hot iron, either on the back or the hip, identifying them with their owners. Now the Negro slave was indeed the property of the Jewish purchaser. If he fled, he could be identified. Following this procedure, there was a farewell celebration. There were instances when entire families were brought out of the interior to the coast, and then separated through the byre, the father going with one ship, the sons and daughters into another. These farewell celebrations were usually packed with emotion, tears, drama, and sadness. There was little joy, if ever. The following day the transport began from land to ship. It was managed by taking 4 to 6 Negroes at one time in rowboats to the ship. Of course, the slave dealers were aware of how the Negro loved his homeland above all else, and could only be induced by great force to leave it. So, some of the Negroes would leap into the water, But here the overseers were prepared with sharp dogs and retrieved the fleeing men. Other Negroes preferred drowning. What came aboard alive was immediately undressed. Here was another opportunity to jump overboard and reach land and freedom. But the slave dealers were pitiless and ruthless. They were merely concerned to get their black cargo to America with the least loss. Therefore, an escapee, recaptured, had both of his legs cut off before the eyes of the remaining Negroes in order to restore order. On board the ship, the Negroes were separated into 3 groups. The men were placed in one part of the ship, the women into another, whereby the lusty captain arranged it so that the youngest, mostly comely Negro women were accessible to him. The children remained on deck, covered with a cloth in bad weather. In this fashion, the slave ship proceeded on its journey to America. In the main, the ships were too small and not at all suitable to transport people. They were barely equipped to transport animals, which the Negroes were likened to. In one space, 1 meter high, 39 inches, these unfortunate creatures were placed into a horizontal position, pressed close together. Mostly, they were chained together. In this position, they had to remain for 3 months until the end of the voyage. Rarely was there a captain who sympathized with them or evidenced any feelings whatever for these pitiable creatures. Occasionally, they would be taken in groups to the deck for fresh air, shackled in irons. Somehow these Negroes were expendable and endured much. On occasion, one of them became insane, killing the other one pressed closely to him. They also had their fingernails closely cut so they could not tear at each other's flesh. The most horrible battles came about among the men to acquire a centimeter or 2 for a comfortable position. It was then that the slave overseer stepped in with his bullwhip. The unimaginable, horrible human excrement in which these slaves had to endure these trips is impossible to describe. In the women's quarters, the same conditions prevailed. Women gave birth to children, lying pressed closely together. The younger Negro women were constantly raped by the captain and the crew, resulting thereby in a new type of mulatto as they came to America. In Virginia, or in any other southern port cities, the slaves were transferred to the land and immediately sold. The regular auction would take place, following the method of purchase in Africa. The highest bidder obtained the ware. In many cases, due to the indescribable filth, some of the blacks became ill during the sea voyage from Africa to America. They became unemployable. In such cases, the captain accepted any price. It was rare to dispose of them, for no one wanted to purchase a sick Negro. Therefore, it is not surprising that the Jewish, unethical doctor senses a new form of revenue. They purchased the sick Negro for a small sum, then treated him and sold him for a large sum. On occasion, the captain would be left with a few Negroes for whom he did not find a buyer. In that case, he returned to Newport and sold them to the Jews for cheap domestic help. In other cases, the Jew owner of the ships took them over. This is why the city of Newport and its surroundings had 4,697 black slaves in the year 1756. Slavery did not extend to the North. Moreover, in many of the North American colonies, slavery was strictly forbidden. Georgia came under discussion, likewise also Philadelphia, and again it was the Jews who managed a loophole, which had given them freedom following the Revolutionary War. So they schemed to make slave trading legal. One had but to read the names of those persons living in Philadelphia who were requesting the elimination of existing laws regarding the slavery dealing. They were the Jews Seneford, Lay, Woolman, Solomon, and Benezet. That explained it all. But let us turn back to the slave ship Abigail. Its captain, and we are reading from his ship's books, did a profitable business. He sold all of his Negroes in Virginia, invested some of the money in tobacco, rice, sugar, and cotton, and went on to Newport, where he deposited his wares. We learn from Captain Freedman's books that the Abigail was a small ship and could only accommodate 56 people. He managed, however, to clear from one trip $6,621, which he in turn delivered to the owner of the ship, one Aaron Lopez, the Jew.